All right, we're going to be presenting on the biology of economic status. My name is Jacob Linden, and I'll be presenting with Jackie Days, Christine Liu, and Devin Lingford. So first, we're going to start on the health effects of poverty. One particular study, Kahn et al., examined data from over 1,000 white and African American individuals from the Washington, D.C. area in hopes of determining exactly how race and socioeconomic status are linked to health. To measure health, the authors used three different methods: a self-rated question on overall health, a series of questions on diagnoses for fatal chronic conditions in the past 5 years, and a series of subjective questions on everyday functional impairment. To measure socioeconomic status, they used two objective measures, current income and total wealth, and two subjective measures, past and current financial hardship. Controlling for all other variables, they found that household income, past financial hardship, and current financial strain were all significantly associated with lower general health. Lower income was also associated with higher risk of stroke and heart disease, and past financial hardship correlated strongly with diagnoses for 4 of the 5 fatal diseases measured. Rates of depression and functional impairment were also significantly higher among those with lower income and increased financial hardship, past or present. These results are fairly self-consistent, but one particularly striking trend is that past financial hardship had such a significant and consistent effect on health later in life. This indicates that financial hardship can not only lead to temporary health effects, but also can lead to more permanent ones. Other studies that examined more specific health effects had similar findings. Young et al. Used data from the USRDS database to find whether or not some of the variability in treated end-stage renal disease, the last stage of chronic kidney disease, can be explained by variation in socioeconomic status. The data resulting from the study is at right, where the squares are averages for Black participants and the circles are averages for white participants. They found that overall income was significantly inversely correlated to average incidence of renal disease. Another study, Chilton et al., examined the effects of living conditions in childhood on health outcomes later in life, combining data from many prior studies. Food insecurity remains a big issue, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, even the US. In fact, an estimated 35 million people in the US experienced food insecurity in 2005, or nearly 1 in 8. Undernutrition has detrimental effects regardless of age, but for children, it can be particularly damaging. Food insecurity in childhood is associated with lower physical and mental functionality, increasing odds of developmental risk and higher likelihood of developmental issues. The study also found that those in poverty were more likely to have worse sanitation, which is associated with higher rates of infectious disease.
So poverty has a significant impact on an individual's lifespan. The gap for men shows that upper percentile individuals live 15 years longer than the poorest, while the richest American women live 10 years longer than the poorest women. This data is from a study done by the Health Inequality Project that took income and mortality data from 1.4 billion American records between 2001 and 2014. Another finding from this study was that this lifespan gap is increasing. Individuals in the top 5% of income distribution gained around 3 years in life expectancy, while in contrast, the lifespans of Americans in the bottom 5% of the income distribution did not increase at all in this period of time. However, this doesn't mean that just giving someone money will increase their lifespan. The reasons are more complex and relate to factors such as health behavior and environment. Reasons for life expectancy disparity. Here are some of the main reasons why poverty influences lifespan so much. Chronic stress, an unequal social climate, health behaviors, and geographic variation all tie into the significant impact that poverty has on lifespan. Stress can come from many things. It can be work-related, as low-income individuals frequently have little to no control over their schedules and wages. It can be due to worries about the future, social isolation due to many jobs, and much more. According to a psychological study done in 2000 by Nancy Adler, how people rate their doing relative to others is at least as predictive of health or illness as are any objective measures such as actual income level. This means that life expectancy disparity is much more related to the social situation that lack of money puts an individual in rather than the lack of money itself. In addition, low subjective standing also equals more stress. Another important finding from the Health Inequality Project is how much lifespan among low-income individuals varies across areas. These differences in life expectancy across areas are highly correlated with health behaviors, like rates of smoking, obesity, and exercise. This means that low-income individuals tend to live the longest and have healthier behaviors in cities with highly educated populations and high levels of government spending, such as San Francisco and New York.
Okay, so next we're going to be talking about another big factor of poverty, which is stress. So, and particularly like how stress affects health and physical and psychosocial impact that stress can have. So, for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to be talking about what is coded as bad stress. According to one Brookings Institute article, there's two sides of stress. There's good stress and then there's bad stress. Good stress would be like having to make a deadline on time or applying for college, something rather arbitrary but not detrimental. Whereas bad stress would be stressing about whether you are going to make it above the poverty threshold. So that's the kind of stress that we'll be focusing on because that's what people in poverty face disproportionately. So the idea that stress and poverty are correlational has been brought up before in the Manny et al. Study, where we talked about how farmers, mainly poor farmers, their stress levels increase significantly right before their harvest. So the study was trying to see how people did on cognitive ability tests and that they thought maybe the stress factor was a huge indication of why people in poverty tended to score lower on these cognitive ability tests because their judgment and perception was impaired by the stress that they were facing. So this kind of sparked our interest in trying to discover how much more prevalent stress is in low-income people and also what effects that stress has on people in poverty. Oh, and then this next graph is an introduction to kind of give you a look at the disproportionate amount of pain and stress people in low-income communities face. This graph is from the Brookings Institute, which was done by a Gallup Health Survey in 2013, and it demonstrates pain, worry, sadness, stress, and anger levels based on your economic class. So I think through this graph, the disparities are very, very clear. It's evident like that on every single one of these categories, the difference from the levels that poor people face to the levels that people in the middle class face is so drastic. And then it's a little stagnant from middle class to rich. And I think it's really important to focus on that huge gap because it exacerbates a lot of further problems. And also in America, we are known for having such like a big inequality gap. And so it's important to think about why that gap exists and what further problems that it exacerbates. And on the next few slides, we're going to expand more on stress particularly and how that impacts low-income communities. So this information is also from an article published by the Brookings Institute that really wants to focus on the gap between the rich and the poor in America and find out what that means for the people existing in that gap right now, but also how that gap is currently expanding. So they found that the poor people tend to have lower levels of life satisfaction, are far more likely to have higher stress levels, and are far less optimistic about the future. So when you tie that in with good stress versus bad stress, like we talked about here earlier, basically the rich tend to have more stress about the future. So they're thinking about like how I'm going to make my next million or next steps for their company. Whereas poor people are thinking about how they're going to get through the day. So essentially, this is a disparity with stress that kind of further perpetuates the inequality gap. Because at the end of the day, like the rich are focused on getting richer and the poor are focused on making it through the day. And so it kind of like makes it harder to intergenerational to move like economic classes. And the article talked about like how the American dream, like so to say, is like less likely for poorer people. So it's also known as like the Gatsby curve, which demonstrates that a child's success has a lot to do with their parents' incomes as well. So also in surveys, they found that the higher the Gini coefficient was in an area, the higher levels of stress there were. And when they dissected this more, they found that across the nation, the stress levels of the rich were all the same. But in those areas with high inequality, meaning a high Gini coefficient, the poor people were much more stressed than areas that were a little more equal. So this gap in economic class that we have in our like American system kind of further perpetuates stress and the levels of stress. And so then we're going to explore more about like particularly children and brain development and stress in the next slide. So the first study done by Clancy Blair and Sybil Reaver kind of examines this effects that poverty has on children, and particularly with children's brain development. The first thing they found is that children growing up in poverty had significantly less brain matter in their frontal lobes and hippocampus compared to their peers who had a lot more. This gray matter is directly related to executive functions that the kids may have, and it's further related to achievement in school and academic success. What's more is they found that poverty comes with a lot of external stress factors such as noise or other stressors that impacts children differently and actually alters their brains to react to stress in a different way. Furthermore, these stressors expose the developing brain to a range of negative cognitive, emotional, and behavioral differences. So how do these factors together, the lack of gray matter and the external stressors altering one's reaction to stress, affect the child in its daily life? Blair and Reaver claim that executive function, directly related to gray matter, is essential for self-regulation and school readiness and is a basic building block of early cognitive and social competence. Available evidence indicates that the effects of socioeconomic and early psychological disadvantage on cortisol and brain structure partially mediate effects of poverty on the development of executive function in childhood. So effects of poverty on brain development and executive function are likely one key pathway, along with reduced stimulation for learning, through which poverty is associated with gaps in school readiness and achievement and positive life outcomes. So why does knowing this matter? Earlier in class, we talked a little bit about the idea of the achievement gap and how it should be called the opportunity gap. I think it's really relevant in this situation because knowing what we know about children and how their brain development can be stunted due to poverty, with this knowledge, we can pass initiatives and pass policy that helps focus on mitigating these issues rather than focusing on passing tests and making standards. Our education system is rather homogenous and kind of caters to one particular sect of students, which is, of course, like the middle class and rich students who do not have as many barriers facing them. So the next study by Evans et al. Kind of goes deeper into the idea of the opportunity gap. It agrees with all the same things that the previous study posited with in terms of how stress impacts brain development, but it also talks about the opportunity gap a little more specifically. This study finds that low-income children face disproportionate amounts of stress compared to other classes, and these stressors can be physical, induced by their surroundings like their neighborhood, being that like more crime, more biohazards, more traffic, more environmental factors that negatively impact them, which is also like an effect of redlining. As well as more psychosocial factors like overcrowding in schools, not enough funding in their schools, because of the way of our education system is kind of a hierarchy and the funding goes to the richer areas, as well as personal issues and issues in the house that are directly related to being in poverty, such as stress about food and stress about like family life. And those directly relate to a child's ability to do well in school. They also found that young babies in low-income households demonstrate a higher level of stress, which can directly impact their memory and language abilities. So the study posits that, like, coupled with a lower level of cognitive stimulation, as well as parenting styles, the increased amount of stress in a child impedes on their ability to do well in school. The first example I mentioned of cognitive stimulation has to do with the kids not being involved in extracurricular classes, activities, or not getting extra stimulation that a lot of upper class kids. The second one about parenting, they didn't really posit a lot of convincing arguments, so I'm not going to back that stance, but I think it's because I think it's rather subjective, but also they presented a lot of strong evidence that stress does negatively impact a child and their brain development. And so all this ties into how a child can be disadvantaged from the beginning and not do well because of these things that they cannot control. Yeah. And that's just the last finding from the Evans et al. Study, which says childhood socioeconomic disadvantage leads to deficits in academic achievement and occupational attainment. It's long been argued that such deficits arise because poor children are exposed to inadequate cognitive stimulation, and to parenting styles that don't encourage achievement. We don't dispute the important role of these two variables, but we've outlined here evidence for a new complementary pathway that links early child poverty to high levels of exposure to multiple risks, which in turn elevates chronic toxic stress. And that was just the conclusion of their findings.
And I think when you're talking about poverty in any situation, it's really, really important to also be talking about the intersecting identities that contribute to poverty in a person's life, right? So we're talking about intersecting identities that includes education level, sexuality, ability, age, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class, and race, which are all kind of outlined here. Particular marginalized populations are more likely to be impoverished, which means a policy regarding income inequality should pay really special attention to particular identities who are more likely to be impacted. And we'll start to kind of delve into these on the following slides. All right, so for race, in this graph here, you can see that across all age groups, Black and Hispanic populations are overrepresented in poverty. It's really important also to mention that not included on this graph, unfortunately, definitely should have been included, but Native Americans actually have the highest poverty rate out of all ethnic/racial groups in the US at 25.4%, which was from the 2018 US Census data. And possible reasons for this, there's a really famous study about resumes and like stereotypically Black names on resumes that were identical to stereotypically white names on resumes. People were more likely to be called back if it was a white name. So that's sort of one of many, many studies that are showing employment discrimination. And then there's the history, obviously, of slavery, redlining, which, if you're not familiar with that, is Black communities being pushed out of the housing market, which means they're unable to accumulate generational wealth that way. Immigration restrictions, racism, genocide, institutionalism, and pushing Native communities into reservations. So all of these very, very different historical aspects and even current day aspects that contribute to racial minorities being pushed into poverty at different rates compared to white folks. And then gender identity, of course, is really important to talk about. So women experience higher rates of poverty than men. In 2018 in the US, 12.9% of women lived in poverty compared to 10.6% of men from 2018 Census Bureau data. And then I think it's also really important to talk about transgender folks, specifically trans women, have the highest rates of poverty at 29.4%, just sort of that intersection with gender identity. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this as well. You have very few legal protections for transgender folks in employment in certain states, and obviously sexism, glass ceiling. Okay, and on this slide, we're talking about sexual orientation, and there's sort of an overlap too in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation, because it's usually measured just as LGBTQ plus identity overall, even though there are different aspects of that. And here we're looking at rates of homelessness, which is clearly an indicator of poverty. Up to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ compared to about 7% of the general youth population, which is a huge gap. And I think a lot of potential reasons for this is like when kids come out to their parents in homes that are not accepting of that, they're definitely more likely to experience homelessness, being pushed out of their homes or choosing to leave because of unsafe environments, etc. Yeah, and here's another graph kind of breaking that down. It shows cisgender gay men on one side at 12.1%, which is lower than cis straight men, which is interesting. And then at the highest level, it's transgender folks in terms of poverty rates. And disability. So according to the US Department of Labor in 2017, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, the labor force participation rate for people with disabilities, and that includes physical, intellectual, and developmental, sensory, and other disability categories, age 16 and over, is 20.1% employment compared to 68.6% for people without disabilities of the same age. And I want to be very clear about, for most situations, this is not because disabled people can't work. It's often because of employment discrimination and inaccessible workplaces. So thinking like, if there is a place someone wants to work, but there's no ramps, obviously a wheelchair user is not able to apply there. Or if they do, oftentimes it's really hard to prove employment discrimination because employers can just sort of write it off as anything else, right? Like, oh, we didn't hire this person because there was actually just a more qualified candidate, even though they didn't, in reality, they didn't grant that person an interview because specifically they were disabled.
Okay, so now that we've talked about like how poverty is bad for people's health and how it disproportionately impacts certain groups, we wanted to kind of give a brief overview of poverty in America and some statistics on that. So the official poverty rate, according to the Census Bureau, in 2019 was 10.5%. In 2019, there were 34 million people in poverty, approximately 4.2 million fewer people than in 2018. So a slight improvement. In 2018, households in the top fifth of earners with incomes more than 130,000 brought in 52% of all U.S. income, more than the lower four-fifths combined, according to the Census Bureau data. So again, that gap. In 2018, the poverty rate for whites was 9.1%. The poverty rate for blacks was 18.8%, and the poverty rate for Asians was 7.3%, and the poverty rate for Hispanics was 15.7%. Again, from the US Census Bureau. And that kind of demonstrates like the disparities we were talking about and how the intersection of poverty is really relevant, especially in America.
So a lot of these studies proposed multiple policy changes, and here I will go over a few of them. Because the effect of poverty on the lifespan for low-income individuals varied so much geographically, one possible solution would be for health professionals to make targeted efforts to improve health among low-income populations in cities that are the most heavily affected. In addition, certain Social Security policy changes could be made due to the fact that men and women in the top 1% of income distribution can expect to claim Social Security and Medicare for about 12 and 8 more years than men and women in the bottom 1% of the income distribution. Another policy change would be to increase community support to marginalized populations, as well as strengthening regulations on the ADA to ensure that disability discrimination doesn't occur, and updated guidelines to ensure that disabled people do not lose health care benefits after gaining employment. Thank you so much for watching, and here are our works cited.